When Agenda 21 was first introduced, it arrived wrapped in language that few people would ever think to challenge sustainability, environmental protection, responsibility to future generations. These were not controversial ideas. In fact, they felt morally undeniable. Who would oppose protecting the planet? Who would argue against clean air, clean water, or a livable future for children yet unborn? That is precisely why the conversation never truly began. From the start, Agenda 21 was framed not as a political shift, but as a moral necessity. It positioned itself above debate. Questioning, it didn't feel like civic engagement. It felt like irresponsibility. And when an idea becomes morally untouchable, scrutiny quietly disappears. David Icke has often pointed out that the most effective systems of control do not arrive with force or threat. They arrive with agreement. They appeal to empathy. They use language that makes resistance feel selfish, outdated, or even dangerous. Agenda 21 did exactly that. The plan was presented as a long-term vision for managing resources, urban growth, land use, and environmental impact. On the surface, it sounded like coordination nations working together to solve global problems. But buried beneath the reassuring language was a subtle shift in focus from individual choice to centralized planning. This shift was rarely discussed openly. Instead of asking who decides, the conversation focused on what must be done. Instead of debating authority, the emphasis remained on urgency. Climate change, overpopulation, resource scarcity. These were framed not as complex issues requiring democratic discussion, but as emergencies demanding immediate compliance. Emergencies shorten thought. When people feel threatened, they don't ask long-term questions. They accept short-term solutions. This is not manipulation. It is human psychology. And Agenda 21 relied heavily on this psychological response. Another reason the plan faced little resistance was its gradual nature. Nothing dramatic happened overnight. There were no sweeping announcements that freedom was being reduced or behavior would be regulated. Instead, policies emerged quietly at local levels. Zoning changes, land restrictions, smart city planning, sustainability guidelines. Each change seemed small, reasonable, isolated, but over time, patterns emerged. Communities began to notice that decisions affecting land use, housing, transportation, and movement were increasingly standardized. Policies looked similar across different countries, cities, and regions, even where local populations had not actively demanded them. The promise of sustainability began to feel less like protection and more like management. What made this especially effective was the absence of visible enforcement. No one was forced, no one was dragged. Compliance was encouraged through incentives, funding access, social pressure, and moral framing. Those who raised concerns were not silenced, they were dismissed as uninformed or resistant to progress. That dismissal mattered. When questioning becomes socially unacceptable, systems no longer need to defend themselves. Silence is maintained not by force, but by discomfort. People learn quickly which questions lead to isolation and which lead to approval. Agenda 21 thrived in that environment. The public conversation remained focused on outcomes, greener cities, reduced emissions, smarter infrastructure, while the mechanisms of decision making faded into the background. Who controls the data? Who defines sustainability? Who benefits from centralized oversight? These questions were rarely asked, not because they were forbidden, but because the framing made them feel unnecessary. And yet, over time, unease grew. People began sensing that something fundamental was changing, that ownership was becoming conditional, that movement was increasingly monitored, that personal choice was being redefined as a problem to be managed rather than a right to be protected. This chapter is not about denying environmental responsibility. It is about recognizing how noble intentions can be used to justify profound structural change without meaningful public consent. The promise sounded too good to question. And because it wasn't questioned early, its implications were never fully examined. In the next chapter, we will explore how language itself became the most powerful tool in reshaping behavior and perception without ever appearing authoritarian. Control does not always arrive through laws or force. Often it arrives through words, quietly, gradually, almost invisibly. Long before behavior is managed, perception is reshaped, and language is the tool that makes this possible. One of the most overlooked aspects of Agenda 21 is not what it proposes, but how it speaks. David Icke has repeatedly warned that when words change meaning, reality soon follows. Language does not merely describe the world, it defines what can be thought, debated, and resisted. When definitions shift, opposition weakens without realizing why. Take the word sustainability. On the surface, it means balance, living in a way that preserves resources for the future. Few would argue against that, but in policy language, sustainability quietly expands beyond environmental care into human behavior management. Housing, transportation, energy use, food choices, and even movement become subject to regulation under the banner of sustainability. What was once a personal decision becomes a collective obligation. Another key phrase is smart growth. It sounds progressive, intelligent, efficient, but smart growth often means centralized planning decisions made not by communities, but by distant authorities using data models and long-term frameworks. The word smart discourages resistance. Who wants to argue against intelligence? Then there is resilience. Resilience sounds empowering, but in policy context, it often means adaptation to imposed conditions rather than choice. Communities are encouraged to become resilient to restrictions instead of questioning why those restrictions exist in the first place. This is not accidental. When language frames control as care, compliance feels virtuous. When restriction is presented as responsibility, resistance feels immoral. The psychological effect is powerful. People begin policing themselves. Words like compliance, alignment, and stakeholder engagement replace older language of consent and participation. You are no longer asked for permission. You are aligned. You are no longer represented. You are engaged. These terms create the appearance of involvement while maintaining centralized authority. Over time, this reshaping of language alters thought patterns. People stop asking, who decided this? They start asking, How do I adapt? That shift marks the moment control becomes internal. Another subtle change is the disappearance of ownership language. Property becomes land use, homes become housing units, citizens become populations. Each change removes humanity from the equation. People become data points, variables to be optimized. Once humans are framed as systems rather than individuals, managing them becomes easier and morally justifiable. This linguistic transformation also affects debate. Those who question policy are labeled anti-science, anti-environment, or anti-progress. Not because they reject care for the planet, but because language has fused dissent with danger. That fusion is critical. When disagreement is reframed as harm, dialogue ends. Importantly, this does not require censorship. It requires social conditioning. People learn which opinions lead to approval and which lead to isolation. Over time, silence becomes voluntary. Agenda 21 did not need enforcement squads or visible authority. It relied on semantic authority control over how ideas are framed and discussed. And once language is owned, outcomes follow naturally. This chapter is not about denying environmental challenges. It is about recognizing how language can transform genuine concern into a mechanism of compliance. When words are engineered to bypass debate, even well-intentioned people can participate in systems they never consciously chose. By the time the effects are felt restricted, choice, centralized oversight, reduced autonomy, the conversation is already over. The words have done their work. In the next chapter, we will examine how global plans quietly override local choice and why so many communities feel decisions are being made for them rather than with them. One of the first signs that something fundamental is changing is when decisions begin to feel distant, not openly imposed, not aggressively enforced, just unreachable. People wake up one day and realize that choices affecting their land, their communities, and their daily lives no longer seem to come from places they can see or influence. This is where Agenda 21 quietly shifts from theory into lived reality. David Icke often highlights that the most effective form of control is not dictatorship, but administrative distance. When authority becomes layered, distributed, and abstract, resistance dissolves not through fear, but through confusion. Agenda 21 operates precisely in this space. Rather than appearing as a single global mandate, it manifests through regional policies, city planning initiatives, funding conditions, and regulatory frameworks. Each piece looks local. Ach, Decision appears independent. But when viewed together, the similarities are striking. Cities across different countries begin adopting identical development models. Land use restrictions expand simultaneously. Transportation systems are redesigned around the same principles. Rural land access quietly tightens. And yet, many residents never voted on these changes. This creates a subtle but powerful disorientation. People feel governed, but cannot identify the governor. Authority becomes decentralized in appearance while remaining centralized in structure. Local councils often justify changes by citing international standards, best practices, or compliance requirements tied to funding. In this way, responsibility shifts upward. Local representatives become administrators rather than decision makers. The phrase, "we have no choice," becomes common. This is not tyranny in the classical sense. No soldiers arrive, no rights are revoked overnight. Instead, options narrow, incentives guide behavior, funding rewards compliance. Resistance becomes economically inconvenient. And inconvenience is far more effective than force. Communities that push back are not crushed, they are bypassed. Development moves elsewhere, resources dry up, pressure builds quietly until compliance feels like the only practical option. Over time, this erodes the concept of local sovereignty. Decisions about land use, housing density, agriculture, transportation, and energy are increasingly made according to global frameworks rather than local needs. Cultural differences fade. Regional identity weakens. Uniformity replaces diversity, all under the banner of efficiency and sustainability. What makes this especially difficult to challenge is its moral framing. Any objection can be portrayed as selfish, short-sighted, or harmful to the planet. The conversation shifts from who decides to why you're resisting. This inversion shuts down debate. People are no longer defending their right to choose, they are defending themselves against accusations of irresponsibility. That psychological shift is crucial. Once guilt replaces dialogue, power no longer needs justification. Another effect of this system is the loss of accountability. When policies originate from complex networks of agencies, agreements, and partnerships, no single entity appears responsible. Complaints move in circles, authority becomes diffuse. Diffuse authority is almost impossible to confront, and so people adapt instead. They accept smaller living spaces. They accept increased monitoring. They accept reduced mobility. They accept conditional access, not because they agree, but because resistance feels futile. This is how global plans override local choice without ever announcing themselves as control systems. The structure does the work. The language provides cover, and the distance ensures silence. This chapter is not claiming malicious intent. It is revealing a mechanism, a system that prioritizes coordination over consent, efficiency over freedom, and compliance over choice. Once local decision-making erodes, regaining it becomes difficult. People forget what participation felt like. They adjust expectations downward, and eventually centralized authority feels normal. But normalization does not mean legitimacy. It simply means repetition. In the next chapter, we will explore how control no longer requires force at all, and why modern systems rely on incentives, digital infrastructure, and behavioral conditioning instead of visible authority. For most of human history, control was obvious. Kings ruled by decree, empires expanded through conquest, authority was visible, physical, and often violent. If someone wanted power, they used force to take it. But that model is outdated and inefficient. Modern control works very differently. David Icke often explains that the most advanced systems of control are the ones people don't recognize as control at all. They don't rely on fear of punishment. They rely on behavioral guidance, incentives, and psychological conditioning. Agenda 21 reflects this shift perfectly. Instead of telling people what they must do, it creates environments where only certain choices remain practical. You are not ordered, you are guided. You are not forced, you are nudged. And because no one feels directly threatened, resistance rarely forms. This is control through design. Cities are restructured so that movement becomes dependent on approved systems. Housing policies encourage density rather than space. Energy usage is monitored and optimized. Consumption patterns are tracked and improved. None of this feels like domination, it feels like modernization. But modernization always comes with conditions. Access becomes conditional. Participation becomes monitored. Freedom becomes measurable. The genius of this system is that compliance is rewarded, not enforced. Those who align receive benefits: funding, access, convenience, social approval. Those who don't are not punished, they are excluded. Opportunities quietly disappear. Costs rise. Life becomes more difficult. This form of pressure is far more effective than violence. People comply not because they are afraid, but because they want to live comfortably. And comfort is a powerful motivator. Another key element of this model is data. Digital systems allow behavior to be measured, predicted, and shaped. When systems know how people move, consume, communicate, and respond emotionally, they no longer need to command, they can anticipate. Anticipation replaces authority. Policies are adjusted in advance. Options are limited before resistance forms. Systems respond automatically, impersonally, and without visible decision makers. Responsibility becomes abstract. Power becomes faceless. This creates a sense that this is just how things are. And when systems feel inevitable, people stop questioning them. Social pressure reinforces this effect. Those who question centralized planning or digital oversight are framed as disruptive, uncooperative, or uninformed. They are not argued with, they are marginalized. That marginalization teaches others a lesson without a word being spoken. Over time, people internalize the rules. They monitor themselves. They adjust their behavior voluntarily. They avoid asking uncomfortable questions because they already know the social cost. This is the ultimate goal of modern control, self-regulation. When people police themselves, authority no longer needs to intervene. The system runs smoothly, efficiently, and invisibly. Agenda 21 fits neatly into this model because it does not present itself as authority. It presents itself as guidance, best practice, responsibility, and care. It claims to protect the future, which makes questioning it feel reckless. But protection without consent is still control. This chapter is not claiming a single mastermind or malicious intent. It is describing a structure, a way of organizing society where freedom is not taken, but slowly redesigned. And redesign is far harder to resist than repression. By the time people realize how much autonomy has been lost, the systems are already embedded. Reversal feels impossible. Resistance feels impractical. Adaptation feels easier. That is how control succeeds without force. In the next chapter, we will explore why environmental fear is such a powerful driver of compliance and why protecting the planet has become the most effective emotional justification for centralized authority in modern history. Fear has always been the fastest way to change human behavior. But not all fear works the same way. Fear of invasion creates resistance. Fear of tyranny sparks rebellion. Fear of environmental collapse, however, produces something very different: submission mixed with guilt. And that combination is extraordinarily powerful. David Icke has often noted that when fear is paired with moral responsibility, people don't need to be controlled, they volunteer. Environmental fear operates at this exact psychological level. It doesn't threaten individuals directly, it threatens everything: the planet, the future, children not yet born. When fear is framed this way, questioning becomes emotionally dangerous. No one wants to be seen as the person who didn't care. This is why environmental narratives are uniquely effective. They bypass politics, culture, and ideology. They reach directly into identity. You are no longer debating policy, you are declaring what kind of human being you are. And once morality replaces discussion, power no longer needs justification. Agenda 21 relies heavily on this emotional leverage. The message is subtle but consistent. The world is in crisis, time is running out, and extraordinary measures are required. Under normal circumstances, people would demand debate before accepting restrictions. But when catastrophe is emphasized, urgency overrides scrutiny. Emergency thinking shortens attention spans. When people feel the future is at stake, they accept oversight they would normally reject. They surrender autonomy in exchange for reassurance. They tolerate surveillance because it feels protective. They accept limits because they believe the alternative is extinction. Fear doesn't need to be constant. It only needs to be background noise. A steady sense of looming danger keeps populations compliant without panic. It creates an atmosphere where control feels like care and restriction feels like responsibility. Another reason environmental fear is so effective is that it lacks a clear enemy. There is no army to fight, no single villain to oppose. The threat is abstract, diffuse, and permanent. Climate, emissions, sustainability. These are not problems that can be defeated. They can only be managed, and management requires authority. When a problem has no endpoint, control has no expiration date. This creates a permanent justification for oversight. Policies introduced as temporary become permanent. Restrictions framed as emergency measures become standard practice. People adapt, and adaptation becomes acceptance. Over time, fear transforms into identity. People begin defining themselves by compliance. They signal virtue through alignment. They measure worth through participation. Consumption choices become moral statements. Behavior becomes a public performance of responsibility. This internalizes control. No one needs to enforce rules when people enforce them on each other. Social pressure replaces authority. Shame replaces debate. Dissent becomes socially radioactive. This is where environmental concern shifts from care to control. The original intention, protecting nature, becomes secondary to maintaining the system built around it. the system grows, the infrastructure expands, the oversight deepens, and questioning any part of it becomes synonymous with denying reality. But caring for the planet and surrendering autonomy are not the same thing. This chapter is not about rejecting environmental responsibility. It is about recognizing how fear can be used to justify permanent control structures that outlive the crisis they were built around. When fear becomes policy, freedom becomes negotiable. The most dangerous aspect of environmental fear is not that it's false, but that it's open-ended. There is always another threshold, another target, another reason to tighten control. And because the threat is framed as existential, resistance always feels selfish. People don't resist because they don't want to be the ones blamed for collapse. And that is the final layer of control, guilt. In the final chapter, we will ask the most uncomfortable question of all: can a system truly protect humanity while steadily reducing human choice? And why that question is the one we are never encouraged to ask. After all the policies, all the language, all the urgency, one question remains quietly off limits. It is not shouted down. It is not officially banned. It is simply never encouraged. And yet, it may be the most important question of all. Can a system truly claim to protect humanity while steadily reducing human choice? David Icke has long argued that control in the modern world does not announce itself as control. It presents itself as protection, safety, responsibility, care. And because these values are genuinely important, the systems built around them are rarely questioned. But protection without consent is not protection, it is management. Agenda 21, when viewed in its entirety, raises this uncomfortable tension. On one hand, it speaks of balance, sustainability, and long-term survival. On the other, it introduces structures that centralize authority, standardize behavior, and condition participation on compliance. This contradiction is rarely addressed directly. Instead, the conversation is guided away from fundamentals and toward outcomes, cleaner cities, lower emissions, smarter infrastructure. These goals are not inherently harmful, but the path toward them matters just as much as the destination. When systems define what is acceptable behavior, who decides those definitions? When access becomes conditional, who sets the conditions? When oversight expands, who watches the watchers? These questions are not radical, they are foundational, and yet they remain unanswered. One reason this question is avoided is because it forces a choice between comfort and autonomy. It asks people to examine whether convenience has quietly replaced freedom and whether safety has been redefined as obedience. That examination is uncomfortable. Modern systems rely on participation. They function best when people cooperate willingly. Questioning the system threatens that cooperation, not because people would revolt, but because they might pause. And pause is dangerous to momentum. Another reason the question is discouraged is that it exposes a deeper truth. Once control is normalized, it rarely reverses itself. Oversight introduced for protection does not easily relinquish power. Temporary measures quietly become permanent. Infrastructure remains even after the justification fades. History shows this clearly. Emergency powers linger surveillance expand. Restrictions evolve rather than disappear. And because these changes happen gradually, people adapt. What once felt intrusive becomes routine. What once felt unacceptable becomes just how things are. This is not a conspiracy, it is a pattern. The question Agenda 21 ultimately forces is not about the planet, but about humanity's relationship with authority. Can global coordination exist without erasing local choice? Can sustainability be pursued without turning people into variables to be managed? Or must freedom always be sacrificed in the name of survival? This chapter does not offer a final answer. Instead, it offers awareness. Awareness that caring for the earth and surrendering autonomy are not the same thing. Awareness that good intentions do not automatically produce just systems. Awareness that questioning does not equal denial. True responsibility includes asking difficult questions. The future does not belong to systems alone. It belongs to people thinking, choosing, consenting people. And any plan that claims to protect humanity must be willing to face scrutiny from the very humans it seeks to guide. Agenda 21 may never announce itself as control, but control does not require announcement. It only requires acceptance. And acceptance begins when questions stop being asked. The most powerful act in any system is not resistance, it is discernment. The willingness to look beyond language, beyond urgency, beyond moral pressure, and ask whether the path forward honors both the planet and the people who live on it. That question remains open, and it always will, as long as someone is willing to ask it. Subscribe to watch more videos and continue exploring the deeper truths behind power, perception, and global agendas.